today I continue. So last time I started building a Great Western Super Saloon from a Comet kit. I'm taking my time with it, and so far I've completed the body shell. This time I'm looking at the bottom half, both the underframe and the bogies. These are two things I've got a reasonable amount of experience doing already, just from upgrading other coaches. For example, see the upgrading B set or the siphon G. However, I expect there to be a slight amount of variation, seeing as it's all being built from scratch. Before we get started, however, we don't need the body shell really, so we remove that from what will become the underframe and pop it to one side. We will need to refer to it later on, just for getting some pieces in the right places, but for the most part we won't really need it. A little tip I didn't really expand upon in the previous instalment was the use of this tape. It's 3mm detailing masking tape. It was £5 for a 50-metre roll, and it's been an absolute lifesaver, with taping the different parts together temporarily and easily, while being so small and so easily workable. 10 out of 10 would recommend over larger tapes. So to start with, something which I have found to be of absolute paramount importance when upgrading coach underframes. Something to mount your work on whilst you're working on it. And nothing is better than a simple bog roll cut in two. We can now mount our underframe on that. See? Paramount. So the first actual work is to bend up these side tabs. These are there to stop the coach sides from bowing inwards. Very simply, fold them up, as previously explained, get them started with tweezers held sideways, or pliers, and then finish off using the desk. After that, it's the turn of the sole bars. These are very self-explanatory. Simply cut out of the fret, clean them up, test fit them, and then the bottom section was folded up. I'll accept these longer sections. A proper bending tool could have helped and made this task a lot easier to carry out, and will have done a better job. However, I managed with what I had, and that's often the best case scenario. The fold was then soldered from behind for strength, and then soldered into place. Soldering from both above and also from behind. As this coach has angled ends, the sole bar bends in at the ends, and as such has some separate parts to create this. These are made up in a similar fashion to the long pieces, and then soldered in place with the two slots towards the end of the coach. These are tack soldered in place from above, and pushed up as far as they could go towards the main section of the sole bar. This is to close up the gap between the two sections. Then again they were soldered from above and behind, and also between the two sections of the sole bar. Once this had been repeated for both ends on both sides, it was necessary to file the outermost tabs flat on the top of the underframe, as the body needs to mount directly onto the chassis there. Once the sole bar is complete, the buffer beam can be started. For now, it's just a case of the buffer beam and the backing piece. The rest of the detailing will be added a little later on once all the soldering has been completed on the chassis, as there is potential that the soldering iron could melt the white metal castings, and that isn't ideal. I just found it was a case of getting it all lined up by eye and tack soldering. Once I was happy with it was in the right place, I soldered it fully in place, and then the little backing piece was soldered on for strength. Once they were all soldered on, I could put on the step boards, which slotted into the holes at the end of the sole bars really easily, and were simply soldered from behind, making sure that they remained level. After that, it's on to one of my favourite items, the trussing. Don't ask me why I love it, I just do. I've stated this many a times before, it is just uber satisfying. The ends of these were cut from the underframes, however the centre bits were not. I found that it might have been easier doing this before attaching the sole bars and buffer beams, but I didn't twig on that when I was reading through the instructions beforehand. They were cut, were folded out, and the end sections were then soldered into the right position. I figured out where that needed to be by pairing the chassis with the body, and then comparing to photos to whereabouts the trussing joined the sole bar, using the window frames for reference. Once I had soldered the ends in place, I soldered the centre parts to the sole bars for strength as well. The last part of soldering for the chassis was making up the brake V hangers and the one brass battery box. These, along with the white metal castings, were then glued into place using 2-part epoxy whilst comparing to the diagram supplied. Brake rigging and such was also added using the supplied diagram, and at this point I also glued the buffers into place. I would have also glued a hook as well, however there wasn't one supplied in the kit weirdly, so I went into my box of spare parts and found some on an old Brass Masters sprue, and these were also glued into place using 2-part epoxy. Now onto the bogies. These are reasonably simple, but can be a little frustrating, as you need to drill out all of the 0.45mm holes. And if you can be a little bit heavy-handed, like this oaf right here, you can find yourself needing a new drill bit pretty soon. Once the smaller holes are drilled out, the holes for the bearings also need widening to be able to accept your chosen bearing, which are then simply soldered into place. Whilst using the drill, I also drilled out the hole where the bolt attaching the bogie to the underframe went through. And then the bogie was then cut from the fret, and I could start thinking about folding it all up after cleaning up the cuts. These again were all folded with the aid of some tweezers held sideways, and then using the bench to finish off the larger folds. Once all were folded, I inserted the wheels whilst it was a little bit looser. After doing all these joints on both these bogies and some done previously, I still don't really have a tip for making this easier, as it is just a bit fiddly, and can be infuriating when the end bar keeps moving and unsoldering. However, aside from persistence, I have little to offer in the way of a top tip on these. But once that was all soldered up, I turned to the brake blocks. These initially proved tough. However, I tried something which I thought would be a silly idea of using blue tack to hold the blocks in place. However, this turned out to be a pretty good idea, even if I do say so myself, just providing I didn't overheat the brass and melt the blue tack, which I did once or twice, and this made it somewhat tough to remove the blue tack cleanly. But aside from that, the brake blocks went on really well and quite easily. Once they went on, it was time for the white metal sides. The hole for the bearings needed enlarging. The same drill bit we used to fit the bearings into the fret. This was then pushed onto the brass and held in place with some epoxy. And then that's the bogie complete. I'm going to cover the couplings in the next video, so be sure to come back to check those out. But for now, the coach body was bolted onto the underframe, and the bogies then bolted onto the underframe as well, and I got the chance to admire where all my handiwork has got me to so far. Next video, we'll be looking at the interior, the couplings, and any other small little details that may have been missed. And I may, just may, even look towards the painting as well, but we shall see. So come back and check that out when it goes live. Until then, click like and subscribe, as that will help destroy COVID. I have no scientific proof of this, I'm just remaining positive that it might.